Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar today, hosted by the Bay Area News Collective. I'm Amy Schmitz-Weiss. I'm a journalism professor in the School of Journalism and Media Studies at San Diego State University, and I'm going to be your moderator today. Today, we're going to be talking about local news representation from the lens of spatial and geo approaches in particular. And so with us today, we have three newsrooms that were partners in the Bay Area News Collective that was done last year, along with Bloom, a location technology company that works with newsrooms on spatial and geo aspects. And so what I thought we would do first of all is just to introduce you a little bit to each person that's with us today so you know a little bit about them. First we have is Ryan Nakashima. Ryan is currently a senior product manager of digital subscriptions at Media News Group. He was a longtime reporter at the Associated Press covering the media and technology space before pivoting to the product and business side, with the aim of helping legacy news organizations turn the digital corner. We also have with us is Tim Olson. Tim is currently the Senior Vice President of Strategic Partnerships at KQED. He has also held roles as a head of product and head of education. Tim works frequently with NPR and PBS on digital product and infrastructure initiatives. And we also have with us Kat Rollins. Kat is the president of Bay City News Service, executive director of Bay City News Foundation, and editorial director of Local News Matters. She's worked as a journalist for over 35 years, covering news in the Bay Area, Central California, and overseas. And we also have with us Stephen Jefferson. Stephen is the founding director at Bloom Labs, a technology startup that helps newsrooms explore new approaches to local audience research and development. He helped to facilitate the Bay Area News Collective project with the Google News Initiative last year. So that's a little bit about each of our panelists that you're going to get to know a little bit more about today. And we're going to start our conversation with them just briefly and then open up time for Q&A as well from you all. So if you have any questions at any point in time, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A and we'll get to them during this hour. We're going to go ahead and start first with Stephen, because Stephen is at the heart of this Bay Area News Collective. And if you could tell people here a little bit about how this project came to be and share a little bit about that with everyone before we jump into our conversation.
Thank you, Amy. Hey, everyone. I'm Stephen. I'll switch here. I'm going to show a few slides right now on the screen just to kind of introduce the Bay Area News Collective, how it came about. So as Amy was introducing, I'm a part of Bloom Labs, which was the facilitator of Bay Area News Collective. This is also a collaborative newsroom project that partnered with 7 different newsrooms, along with Bloom Labs, which is just a technology company. The News Collective was throughout a full year, December 2020 to October 2021. And the goal of the project was to identify and respond to patterns of local news representation, or the lack thereof, through the perspective of personal experiences from local residents and current geolocated news coverage in the Bay Area region. The project's collaborative approach has enabled us to leverage different patterns that are more inclusive of news coverage as we bring together insights from multiple newsrooms collectively and simultaneously. The resulting outcomes of the project were actionable and valuable. It was really exciting to work with all these newsrooms together, and it helped to guide a way for us to all produce more diverse and equitable news experiences and content. The partners that were in the Bay Area News Collective, there were 7 total newsrooms that covered the Bay Area to some extent. Some were very hyper-local, others covered many counties, and many of the representatives are on this call as panelists today to answer your questions and discuss their experiences. For the entire year of the project, we collected just over 8,200 stories. These were stories that were published within the time frame of the project. Just to note, we did not retroactively go in the past. This was just for the given year of the project. Throughout those stories, there were about 484 neighborhoods in the Bay Area that we tracked. And we spent almost 10 hours interviewing residents that were in the local communities. One thing I do want to note about the neighborhoods, some of the stories were very specific to street level. Others were very kind of broad to the county level. We looked at all different depths, all different depths of the geography in the Bay Area and tried to see what we can learn from that. I also want to mention that the project, the first half of the project, we focused on gathering data and doing some research around the content, the news data. The second half of the project, we began looking at resident interviews, and we began to combine the news data with those interviews and produce experiments based off of that data. So there were a few phases of data collection, but in the end, we looked to combine the quantitative data with the qualitative interview data that we had gathered. We had, throughout the interviews and throughout the whole project, really, we were gaining insights. It's really special when you begin talking with multiple newsrooms at once about their content and about their coverage area, as well as talking with residents about news coverage in their community, when you don't necessarily ask them specifically about a newsroom source, but ask them about news in general throughout the region. You can gain a lot of insights from that. That's what we learned. There were definitely a lot of things that stood out that were geographic related. For example, proximity, campus newspapers versus more regional newspapers. We also identified or discovered 7 different factors for local news representation that we call representation indicators. This is one insight that we found and documented. Again, throughout the whole project, we kind of came across these different patterns and made note of them and tried to see what type of experiments we could do with them throughout the project, or what direction that could guide us into kind of viewing the data from a new direction. If you're interested in learning more about the Bay Area News Collective now or later, perhaps following along with us, you're welcome to visit bloom.li/Bay Area News Collective. There's a list of links there that go that kind of talk about either the full project report. There's a link to a map experiment that we produced, and there's also a link to some articles and other materials that we've put together. I am going to switch tabs really quick. I want to show you an example of one of the things that we produced. This is an interactive map of stories, of all the stories. We built this experiment with Bloom Labs and began testing different ways that we could provide local news experiences to residents with respect to learning and kind of improving how they feel represented by this content. We're happy to talk more about how we came to this particular experiment and what we learned from this as well.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I think that was really helpful to have that foundation for everyone to know exactly what the collective is and how it formed and evolved as we jump into some of these questions. And I see that we have a question already from Jill. And so we'll get to your question shortly here in a moment, Jill, that you posted. First of all, I just wanted to ask, each of you, you have worked with journalism in the Bay Area for many years, each of you has. And if you could tell me exactly why you decided to participate in this project and what were you hoping to learn from it? I think we'll go ahead and start with Kat, if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So Bay City News has 2 arms. One is a regional news wire that serves most other media outlets in the region. And the other is a public service free site at localnewsmatters.org, which is intended for readers to be able to find stories that are of interest to them and that might not be covered well by other media. And the two together give us a lot of flexibility to cover news, but a lot of it is just pushed out. And where we need more information to do better work is to bring feedback in. And so this project was a really fantastic way to add another layer of data to help us see internally where we were covering things, where partners in this project were covering stories, what kinds of stories. And then also to get that feedback from readers themselves to be able to see where people were looking, what kinds of stories they were looking for, and for them to be able to find things, surface things that were geographically relevant to them. So this was a whole new way of doing the work of evaluating how we're covering the news and how to fill in the gaps.
Thanks, Kat. I think that's really helpful to understand exactly what you were hoping to get out of the project. Ryan, would you also like to tell us a little bit about it from your side too?
Sure. So yeah, we at Mercury News, we were working with Stephen and Bloom for a couple of years now. And originally it was, we knew we had a WordPress CMS, website, and local news, what distinguishes local news from national news? Of course, it's local, it's relevant to you. So was definitely looking for a geotagging kind of tool. You look at some big tech players, what they're doing with, ice cream near me, Google does stuff like that. And so news near me seems to be a logical next step. Stephen, had a suite of tools that allowed us to tag stories and visualize them. So it was easy to set up. Stephen charged a very modest price and was very helpful in I was willing to be a guinea pig for a whole bunch of experiments and would love to see this take off. I think there's especially if there's a standard around geotagging and surfacing these stories, it could be a really great experience for users in the future. And this is how we ought to be using technology, I think, and super serving local audiences. So just happy to be part of the further experimentation with a bunch of great newsrooms. So yeah.
Thanks, Ryan. I think I'm going to come back to you on that point about a standard, to create in the space in a little bit, because I think that's a really important point that you just brought up. Tim, how about for you in terms of KQED? How did you think about getting involved with this and what were you hoping to learn from it?
Yeah, so +1 on Ryan and Kat and their reasoning, and just to sort of build on that, macro, it's like the local news ecosystem, and a healthy local news ecosystem is really important. And I think everybody on this call, and also actually looking at the participants, I'm sure they're all like real proponents of that. And to Ryan's point, the more we can learn about how geography can really help with discovery and it can help with users, the better. So we got to deep dive on that. As you all know, there's like a lot of research that shows that when the local news ecosystem is healthy, democracy is healthier. I'll throw some stuff in the chat about some stats on that, but voting rates, people running for office, covering, saving lives around COVID, exposing corruption, social cohesion, all those things that are so top of mind right now more than ever. And every story comes from a place, right? So it really matters to have reporters in place. National, we all like New York Times, we all rely on BBC and other things, but we need people in the places where these stories actually originate. And public media, that's a big focus for us. There's over 3,000 local journalists coming from some place across public media. That's more than AP. We are owned and operated by the communities that we serve, nonprofit, and serving in KQED's case, the 9-county Bay Area, right? So we're really focused on the 9-county Bay Area, and we have 100 reporters sort of waking up in those counties. reporting on those counties. So back to Ryan's point, I really want that information to inform us in our reporting, as well as be exposed to audiences and where need to through these technology companies who are the gateways to a lot of that content, like where can geography help?
Thanks so much, Tim. I appreciate you telling us that from your perspective and exactly how KQED came into this project. I wanted to jump over to a couple of the questions that are popping over in the Q&A, and I think some of them, perhaps, Stephen, you might be able to address. Jill Center was asking about the definition of expanding geography spheres, and if this covers San Joaquin and Stanislaus counties. If that's something that you might be able to address and talk about here, or perhaps the other experts here in the webinar too.
Yeah, so we did not cover those two counties. The geography that was covered in this project, initially it was proposed to just cover kind of the city of San Jose and maybe some of the neighboring regions, like very small neighboring regions outside of San Jose. But as we spoke to new newsroom partners about their interest in the project, that coverage area, the collective coverage area, began to expand. And so East Bay Times, Marin Independent Journal, KQED, Bay City News, all of these kind of larger newsrooms have much larger coverage areas. And so we've changed the initial proposal and began to expand the coverage area and expand where we were looking at, for patterns in the locations of stories. So yeah, those, I think there was a total of 12 different counties that stories were located in, but those two that were mentioned were not two of them.
And we also have a question here from Jill Ellen Kaiser, wondering about specifically the aspects of publications and media that were non-English language media and Spanish, and wondering if this was a part of the project or not, and if not, if you wanted to expand on that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's a great question. So the newsrooms there were a ton of newsrooms that I had initially reached out to, that our team at Bloom Labs reached out to, just to gauge their interest in this type of project of understanding local news representation from a geographic perspective. There were only a handful that were onboarded onto the project and became full-time partners. None of them were produced 100% Spanish speaking or non-English language media, unfortunately, but that is a great point. But I hope that answers your question, and hopefully, other projects in the future could cover, perhaps other languages and get other insights that from what we got.
We have a Spanish language site called Excelsior in Southern California on the same back end. So, that's a potential. We could convince them to join at some point.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity to move forward in different aspects, different areas and regions from this particular project, it sounds like, Stephen. So I wanted to jump back to, and we'll come back to some of the Q&A here in a little bit as well. And I wanted to talk with Kat briefly, because you brought this up a few minutes ago about looking at how much this project helped your newsroom understand local news resources in the area a little bit more. And I was hoping that you could tell everyone a little bit more what that meant. How did you integrate the project's activities with your team? What would be an example of how that was helpful for you and your team?
Sure. So one thing, just on a very practical, logistical level, we trained everyone on how to geotag every story that we did. And also had somebody who was in charge of actually going back to be sure that we hadn't missed any, because we were really hoping for a holistic view of our coverage. And the way that the maps work, you can filter with time and type of story and place to really get a good feel for what's being covered. And because of the literal map that you look at and a very visual presentation of data, you can also see what you're not covering. And to me, this is one of the big takeaways of the project, is that it's really easy to just go through your day, and we post maybe 40 or 45 stories every 24 hours. And so one day leads into the next, and it's just a tremendous volume. But the map project actually allowed us to look at patterns and to see what we were covering and what the other partners in this project were covering. And then also the reverse, what's being missed, whether it's a geography or a type of story, or you know, an evaluation of how we were using our resources, and if there are ways that we could do it differently. The other thing that was really helpful is that this project showed us what all of us might be covering at the same time. And I think that there are opportunities for us to work more collaboratively and say, okay, if you guys are covering this particular story, that frees up resources for us to do something else. And if we can share content in that way, then we benefit because we're not duplicating effort, and the readers benefit because they're probably getting more stories that otherwise wouldn't be covered. So those were some really practical things that we looked at. And then one other thing I'll say is that we have integrated this into an impact tracker that we use internally, which pulls information like this, also with anecdotal information that our reporters in the field get when they publish a story and a source says, that was great, that was terrible, or you missed something, or here's another idea. And so being able to pull all kinds of different data, including the traditional metrics that we all look at, like how many clicks did your story get and so on, it provides a much fuller picture of what we're doing.
I think that really gets to something unique, Kat, what you were just mentioning is it's kind of a form of thinking of a spatial awareness of the region, and how we can have this aspect of another layer of information about communities in the areas that are being covered in a different way, perhaps in the past, right? That can help not only within your newsroom, but across the collective, as we saw here as well, as you were mentioning. And I'm curious to know, Brian, from your side of things, you know, speaking to this aspect of spatial awareness and how this can be another aspect to see how this evolves in terms of how newsrooms could benefit from this. What do you think are some of the ways that from this particular collaboration helped your newsroom in particular, and could help other newsrooms from this standpoint too?
Yeah, I mean, so for instance, I mean, you know, Kat's Bay City News, they have definitely a wide coverage area. And if you look on the joint map of like all the stuff that service is covering that, you know, Mercury News didn't cover, definitely fills in some holes there. So I think it, you know, proves the value of that service, and as you know, many newsrooms around the Bay Area are actually, you know, clients of Bay City News. It's you know, it's good to know that there's this service that helps us with greater coverage. And you know, in some aspects of, you know, the Merc's own coverage, you know, you may not know unless you have that spatial awareness why a story is really popping. And you know, I noticed this quite a ways back, you know, what, you know, it could be, you know, someone was holed up in a Denny's and was, you know, acting all crazy and you know, threatening people. Well, as a national news, that would never make it, right? You know, it might fall off the map, so to speak. But when you see where it's located and you realize, oh my gosh, this is right in a corridor where lots of people travel all the time, and it's extremely impactful to those people, and they're right in our service area. Well, now you understand you know, why people care about it when it's closer to them. So you know, the fact that you can, you know, dial in and get a better understanding and you know, take care around those things is really important, I think.
I think you give a really good example, Ryan, of exactly the kind of the impact in which that spatial awareness can be put into play. I think, you know, we see aspects of that happening all the time in different communities and different areas, and we may only think within a particular given, you know, intersection, perhaps, right, or immediate block vicinity. But the spatial awareness kind of goes beyond that, right, in terms of looking at it not only within that immediate vicinity, but the impact it has on a wider scale as well, right? And it kind of makes me think over to you, Tim, because I know you've talked about, you know, these aspects of spatiality and geo for a long time. This is a space that you're quite familiar with, that you've been interested in and have done a variety of different experiments over the years in this too. And so how do you see this kind of spatial awareness evolving, perhaps for newsrooms like KQED and others, just as Ryan was mentioning?
Yeah, so I mean, this project was mostly focused on sort of newsroom analysis, like put the stuff out there, and to Ryan and Kat's point, like where are the gaps? Are there regions we're missing? But we have spent a lot of time thinking about and how geospatial news and information is a service to the end user. So that's the flip side of the coin. And so, you know, you think of Yelp or Zillow or Nextdoor, or, you know, Ryan was mentioning like Near Me on Google Maps, right? Consumers are like really use these services all the time. And if you think about news organizations like ourselves as, you know, fact-based information services, there's a lot that we can do with geospatial news, both like in aggregate, like here's everything we do, but also in like a vertical. So as an example, like KQD and other news organizations, we do voter guides by county. So here's the county ones. Or we just did a story not too long ago on high risk fire zones. And we did that in Spanish and English, and it's on a map, right? So you can go in and look in your area, or COVID hospitalization rates by county, or PG&E shutoffs by zip code, etc. Like, so those things are really, and I'll throw the links out to some of those in the chat. They're really powerful tools for end users. And, but you have to have the data structured that way. You have to sort of think that way inside your newsroom. So this project was really helpful along those lines.
I think going over from your point, Tim, you know, of looking at this not only from the newsroom and helping, you know, in terms of thinking and awareness and reflection, as well as, you know, potential next steps, right? We can see the other side of it in terms of the news audience as well. And I kind of want to jump over to Stephen now too, because, you know, during this project, there was, you know, opportunities that you had to engage with community residents in the Bay Area where the geotag news coverage was, and you had a chance to get their ideas and their thoughts. And so I was wondering if you might be able to share here with the people who are attending to tell them a little bit about some of the findings that you had from that aspect. You talked a little bit about it right in the beginning, but if you could kind of give a high level view about some of the major points that came up from that opportunity to engage with the community, I think would be helpful.
Sure. Yeah, it was really interesting to hear from the residents, and it was also interesting to do it virtually. All of these interviews were one-on-one, but through Zoom or another video, you know, online video. But it was a one-on-one conversation about an hour long, and we really got to dive into some questions about how they feel represented. And it's interesting because, you know, you ask a question about community, and the answers are, you know, everyone thinks of community differently. A lot of people may think of it on a geographic perspective and say, you know, well, my neighborhood is such and such, but others don't think about their neighborhood the same way, as, you know, depending on where they live, if it's a small area or a large area, if it's a very communal and, you know, neighborhood like area, people have different perspectives. And so I feel like the interviews that we did were very diverse, and the insights that we got from those, basically there was a lot of patterns, but we identified 7 different patterns on basically how people measure representation themselves, news representation. And this means, when you're asked the question, do you feel represented by local news? What factors do you look at? What factors go through your head as far as, oh, yes, I feel represented because X, or no, I don't feel represented because of Y. Those are representation indicators. I think that, there are plenty out there, I'm sure, but we really narrowed in on 7 of them, such as the proximity of the newsroom to that person, or just the sense of nearness that the newsroom was within their same neighborhood, or the journalists were on their block walking around or somehow engaging locally. There were other indicators in regards to the professionalism, of course, of the local newsroom, and how the journalists connected with the local communities, either on social media or within their sourcing. Those were definitely indicators. A lot of people said that they looked at the author biography before they read the story, and that helped them gauge or measure representation. And so one interesting one that still still surprises me is from the interviews, a lot of people were empathetic for the local newsrooms. And one of the indicators that you may see in our report is called newsroom capacity. And this was the idea that the residents didn't hold the newsrooms entirely accountable for representing them. There's a lot of other information sources, Nextdoor or other platforms, city websites or city apps. There's a lot of areas to get local information, not just a newsroom. So we heard a lot from residents saying that it's okay that the newsroom can't get to my neighborhood. That doesn't make me feel that doesn't reduce my feeling of representation, but they felt represented based off of many sources, non-newsroom sources in their area. And so I thought that was really insightful. It was kind of an empathetic way that I think residents are thinking now of understanding that newsrooms are, have a low staff, a small team, that they're working every single hour of the day and really trying to make things work. There was an understanding of that from a lot of the interviews, and I still find that surprising, like I said. And so, yeah, we dive into that in a little more detail in the report, but that's one of the insights that still stands out to me.
Yeah, and I believe we have it shared in the chat. So if folks want to see the report in particular and go deeper into what you're talking about, Stephen, they can look there as well to see the exact specifics from those opportunities you had to talk with the community. As you pointed out, when we think about representation and identity of communities and local news, it's very nuanced and complex. And I think in many ways, this project has probably provided more questions than answers in many cases. And so I was curious to know, Tim, from your perspective, what gray areas do you think still need to be addressed from here? And what would you like to do from this point forward?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So 2 areas to talk about on that. One is just like the technical and process limitations of geolocating in news stories. There are limitations, right? So to Brian's point, a Denny's incident, a home fire, a pedestrian's killed, a new park opens, those have like addresses or lawns, but police reform, housing bills, like stories like that, like what is the geolocation of that? It's just, and there's also like just pragmatics of like tagging every story correctly and having reporters do that in their process. It's a lot on a newsroom. So, Stephen and I and others in the group have talked a lot about like there's powerful tools out there with AI and natural language processing. There are ways to do this at scale that may or may not be as accurate, but you could do like everything through those sort of filters. So I think there's a dimension of Like where to go from here is like, we're in the process. What type of tools should do this work? Should it really be reporters add that much more to each of their workflows, or can it be done in another way? And then to the other part of your question, like, yeah, like as far as diversity and how newsrooms are engaging with that, geography is just one layer of that. And all of our organizations are working on multiple layers to various degrees of success all the time. So, and it's, you know, it's forever work. But things like the content itself, of course, like, are you just covering the powerful? Or are you really using this as thinking about social justice? Who is the ones that are dictating what stories? How is your pitch process work? Are you covering communities just because of the crime, or are you showing the solutions, solution journalism? Like all that stuff is a big part of it. And of course, the diversity of the newsroom itself. So, you know, source audit, KQED just did a really significant change of our process for all of our sources for stories. Like we try to identify the diversity of those folks. That's a big process thing that's similar to geography. So, you know, we're trying to work on all fronts at once, and geography is one dimension of that.
How about for you, Kat? What do you think is still needing to be addressed from here too, and how would you like to go forward from your side of local news matters and Bay City News?
Yeah, well, I would echo the points that Tim made. Those are all really great issues that we would like to find a way to identify better. So for example, because we actually cover 12 counties, there are topical stories that probably are relevant to everybody, but they don't easily fit into an intersection or a narrow place identifier. So those are a little harder just by their nature in terms of tracking. But those are also the kinds of stories, they tend to be enterprise stories where we have somebody who wants to take a deeper dive. They want to provide context and see how different communities connect or relate to each other. We want to think about solutions journalism, so not just the problem or the crime, but also how we solve those bigger societal ills. And those kinds of stories are often the richest. So we are continuing to tag every story that we write so that we can provide that geospatial context for readers. So there's always a map that goes with the story. But we're also looking at ways where we can build in some evaluation of those bigger contextual pieces. And also to get back to what I was mentioning earlier is that we need to have a better way to identify what we're not doing and if there's demand for it, and how we can get more reader feedback and client feedback, and to be able to reallocate our resources in some cases. So those are all on the radar for us. That impact tracker I mentioned earlier is one way that will help us do that. And it's also what you mentioned, Tim, about just creating a whole new process, which involves reflection on how are we doing, and who are our sources, and what stories are we telling, and how do we tap into the information needs. One thing that we created that would be an interesting next experiment is we have a bunch of information hubs. So we started with one on COVID-19. We iterated to do voter information. We have one for wildfires. We're doing one now on aging. And it's all broken down by county. So we are using a geographic lens. So a reader can pop into Alameda County or San Joaquin County and find the resources that they need. So building maps that are specific to those kind of narrower regions would be a fantastic next step. And then think about how to do it even further. So you narrow down into looking at just Oakland or just Stockton. And I think that would be a valuable reader service. So that's where I'd like to go next.
You know, in tying into what you were just saying, Kat and Tim, you know, as you were mentioning, it entails a different kind of process. It also seems to be the case that it may also entail a different kind of mindset as well in terms of approaching this. How do you see the mindset and the process also working within this kind of new area or different area of looking at the communities and how things are covered. What do you think, Kat, in that regard, in terms of the mindset in addition to the process?
So I would say, I mean, every newsroom is in a time of rapid evolution. And I think that as organizations, we're really reevaluating how we go about doing journalism. And hopefully we're creating a culture where every individual journalist is also thinking in that way. So, you know, we provide feedback all the time, in part through the metrics reports we get, in part through this impact tracker I mentioned, in part through looking at the map feedback. And all of it is meant to say that every day when we're making choices about who we call or what stories we cover, we're thinking a little differently. So it's not just based on experience or hunch, but based on data and being more inclusive in approach. So I think that's a great question and something that we're really trying to cultivate. And we look all the time at others for best practices, because there are newsrooms that are doing a fantastic job of this, and trying to build in some of those to our own practice.
Yeah, just to build on that a little bit, I would say an area of interest to us is how do we use the best of what tech does and combine it with the best of what news organizations do. And what I mean by that, particularly in this data space, you know, you think of news organizations are hardwired to do a couple things like daily news cycles, what's going on right now, and that we're good at. We're also really good at fact-based analysis, who's a real source, who's not a real source, and on that second layer, when you think of all the data that is available now, and with modern tools of AI and scraping, think of every city hall notes, think of all the school board budgets, think of the water quality across every river and every creekway, climate change data. So there's an incredible amount of data out there, and there are organizations that are really good. Stephen works in this space, Google works in this space, Zillow works in this space, at just like taking that data and munging it and putting it out in kind of raw fashions. But what they are not good at is analysis and like, okay, what does this mean that the school board budget is this? What does this mean that it is? How does this affect you? What's actually going on here? Who's trying to lie to you around this kind of presenting it this way? So like, how do we use the best of both? Right here, all of our organizations are in Silicon Valley. Some of these biggest companies in the world that are really good at these tools are right here. And so we've had a lot of conversations in and around this project with those companies about like, how do we use the best of both on those situations? Like, should a newsroom build the entire database of every water table in the California? Or should another organization build that, but we add a layer on top of like these kinds of things, and stories, of course.
A lot of food for thought there, Tim. A lot for us to unpack. I think that could be another webinar we could do in the future to dive into that other aspect. You know, I want to go over to Stephen, because, you know, we've been talking a lot about, you know, the Bloom dashboard here and how it's been used in this particular project. And Stephen, I was curious to find out from you, you know, how you think this particular dashboard that you've created, you know, can help a newsroom editor or a product manager or a journalist in looking at geographic and spatial information at a macro as well as a micro level, and how you think this might help with new steps of a spatial news analysis, in your opinion.
Yeah, great question. I'm glad you brought up the dashboard. That's something I haven't mentioned yet, I don't think. So a part of this project was, part of the funding for this project was to develop a dashboard where all of the geolocated stories coming in from the different newsrooms were combined together into a single view, or a single page where you could kind of filter those stories by geography, also filter them by sentiment or by topic, by the source, a bunch of different things. And I think what that dashboard helped us do, some of the newsrooms here had used that dashboard previously just for their own publications, but what this project helped do is allow the partners to kind of log in, see the collective view of the dashboard, and surprisingly, not just see their stories, but see other stories. And anyone can go to a news website right now and view a list of stories or on a social media feed and see those stories. And it's usually a simple list. But when you see those stories on a map and pinned, and they're all together, and some are very close to each other, and some are far away, others are very much further away, or you begin to see these patterns. Specifically geographic patterns within this project, it's just eye-opening. And I think there was a lot of kind of wow moments. We had monthly meetings with each of the newsroom representatives here throughout last year. And in each monthly meeting, there was, kind of a roundup of, hey, this is what stories have been tagged. Let's take a look at the dashboard. And each time that we did that, it was just like, it was quiet for a minute or two, and we were like, oh, interesting. Like, this wasn't here before. And that's really special, I think, to combine different data sets and see what patterns or what intersections come about from that. I know, there were discussions initially in the project about the sensitivity of that data. We're dealing with newsrooms, of course, any newsroom who wants to be cautious about the data around what they're producing and how that may affect the local communities. And so we were definitely cautious about that and wanted to respect each person's concerns, but we were able to kind of navigate those, navigate the project with those concerns and develop something that was comfortable for everyone involved, and also helped us produce insights and stuff like that. So yeah, moving forward, I think it's definitely an approach that is really interesting. You can think of it from mixing different data sets, whether it's geotag data or whether it's audience data or something like that. I think there's a lot that can be done in the future, not just looking at what your newsroom or what a specific company is producing, but kind of attaching that data set to something else and just seeing where where more patterns come up from that. But yeah, another thing I want to mention, and this kind of came up when Tim was talking, you can produce a big data set or big data and see all, a big spreadsheet of things. But I think the newsrooms definitely have a special tie to the community, especially local newsrooms or, ones that do a lot of community engagement. They have insight that, and all the newsroom teams have insight that are not in those spreadsheets. And you can, so many times we opened up the dashboard and I had a question about some of the data, and I was like, oh, this looks kind of off. And Ryan would say, oh, well, that's a gated community and we're, our journalists aren't allowed in there, or something like that. Or, there is a, business districts here. So it's common that the stories would, we would see this pattern in this geography. So yeah, I think data and what's in a dashboard says one thing, but there's a whole lot more to be said just with having a discussion around that data, and having space for discussion to take place is also important. So I think hosting those monthly meetings was a really important part of this project, allowing access for each newsroom representative and the other members of the newsrooms team to access that dashboard. That was also very insightful. Some of the calls that we had, there were interns that joined and gave their perspective of the data, and photographers and other people in the newsroom. And I think that was really special to hear from different perspectives on how they viewed the data, and pointing out things that we weren't seeing. And yeah, so I thought that was really special.
We have a question here from Maya. SB 911 was introduced in February, which would give grants to local journalism and ethnic media and individuals based in California. And Maya is curious how you think these funds could be used based on the research, from the project. I don't know if that's something you might be able to address, Stephen.
Yeah, there were a lot of kind of like next steps or things where we saw that, that this project could branch into. Or I think one thing, one area was, and I think Kat mentioned this before, but collaborative opportunities. We did identify a lot of intersections between where certain newsrooms were covering that were similar to the geographies that other newsrooms were covering. There was a lot of overlap. There was a lot of overlap with location, within the same time frame, within the same topic. There were also differences that could, elicit a potential collaboration opportunity. For example, education stories published in certain areas that maybe one newsroom was covering very well and another newsroom was covering well over here. But, I think collaboration is a really good opportunity moving forward when looking at geographic data in local news stories across different newsrooms. That's one thing that stood out. Yeah, happy to talk about others, perhaps if we have time.
Thanks, Stephen. Yeah, I think we're coming close to almost the hour. The time's going by fast. What I thought we would do briefly before we end here in a few minutes is if each of you might be able to kind of give a key takeaway that might be helpful for those who are here with us in the webinar of things that they might want to take with them to think about. Why don't we start with you, Ryan, if there's a key takeaway you might have that you'd like to share with everyone.
I think it's still early days, with geotagged news and how we can visualize it and use it. And I would just encourage people to experiment with it. It's important that we use technology that's available to innovate and improve the digital experience for local news, because we are challenged with the economics of the whole system, making sure that smaller audiences are served well. And so, I just would love to keep collaborating, actually. So, I think it's important to keep trying stuff and see what sticks.
Experiment and pioneer, right? Kat, how about for you? What's a key takeaway that might be helpful for those who are attending today?
Well, this whole discussion has been fantastic, so thank you for putting this together. I'm reminded of all the takeaways that we had along the way. And one additional thing that might be a little unexpected is that, Stephen, you were mentioning that it was kind of fun to have other newsroom players join, including interns. And one of the things that I have our interns do is the geotagging, because it helps them to understand everything that we do, and also to ask questions about, like, why did we do this story? And they're just trying to get to know the organization, but it's a reminder to all of the editors and journalists to also ask that question, like, why are we doing this story? And so this project has really been able to surface patterns and data to provide the context and the big picture view. But it's good to have some kind of fresh eyes on everything once in a while. And so we've integrated it into our process in this way. And that's been a great takeaway too, just to remember to go back to that question.
Thank you so much, Kat. How about for you, Tim?
Yeah, there's a lot of ways to take this, and I'd plus one Ryan and Kat. I'll just say one thing that's top of my mind is, and it's been mentioned a little bit in this call already, is like, so local news really matters. However, the way technology companies index content tends to focus very much nationally because of the way their algorithms are structured, right? So whether it's the Google Newsfeed or your Alexa or Apple News, et cetera, like they are very structured to show you the story from the biggest player, because they use indexing tools that are based on volume and link and these types of signals. And one of the great things about local is we don't tend to have that volume, but the stories aren't less important. In fact, they're much more important for many individuals, that the ex-mayor is doing Y, or the thing down the street really matters, or the wildfires that are covered by Ryan or Kat's group, who have people on the ground. That story should surface much higher than somebody writing about that from the East Coast who actually is not on the ground. And so using geography as a signal, to use the parlance of Alexa and Google, all those types, really matters. And some are starting to see it a little bit, like you see Apple News, you see Google Discover, and when you scroll through, you're starting to see that a little more, but it's still very early days, to Ryan's point, in that, oh, like it's the name San Francisco Chronicle means that story is from the region, but not the story itself. So I think there's a lot of upside on building the health of the local news ecosystem by technology companies sort of understanding geography as a signal on a story-based level. And anyway, lots more we could talk about that.
Thanks so much, Tim. And we'll round it out with Stephen, if you want to share your key takeaway.
Sure. Yeah, this is tough. I mean, I've been in the spatial journalism space for many years now, and there was a lot of takeaways that I got from this project, and there was a lot of things that surprised me each month on this project, whether it was talking with people or looking at the data. I think one key takeaway is, I mean, you can always learn. I guess there's multiple perspectives that you can take a look at with location data. It's not just a pin on a map, but it says so much more. And when you begin to combine different data points, or combine different stories, or put some more context around the story, it just really helps to not only define that content, but define how people are feeling about that content. Representation was a core part of this project, and trying to understand how, specifically how geography, was a factor in representation and the feeling of representation. An initial thought when I first started the project, I was like, oh, well, we're gonna see some gaps, and there's gonna be places on the map where there's pins, and there's gonna be places on the map where there's not pins. And it's going to be pretty easy, right? And then when we started looking at it and began talking about it, many things came about. And I think what I'll mention really quick, I guess there's no specific answer there, except, to look at the data from different angles and see what you can find, and keep the community in mind, because you never know how they are viewing the data as well. But I guess I'll leave it there. Yeah.
Thank you, Stephen. Well, we've come up to our hour point here. Time goes by so fast. It'd be nice to have another hour or two to talk about this. Maybe we should do another webinar, part 2. Well, thank you so much, Kat, Ryan, Tim, and Stephen, for your time today to share your insights. And hopefully this has given some, points for those who are attending on things that they might want to think about in their communities and in their newsrooms. And thank you all for joining us today, and have a wonderful weekend. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. See ya.
That's all.